China's massive economic pivot that will shape its and our future. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Insights brought to you by Ainslie Bullion and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, we welcome back Banko, who's once again been looking into everything we're seeing come out of China. And at the moment, there's a lot, really, in terms of their approach to stimulus and global liquidity generally, and lots of other things that are going on there. So how are you going today, Banko?
Yeah, good. Very good. Keen to talk about today's topic. I think there's a wide variety of interesting things coming out of China that we can talk about and how that affects us here in the West as well.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested because it touches on the thing that I'm really passionate about, which is that global liquidity angle and why that's really important, because often these discussions center on the US, and we have to remember the US isn't the whole world. There's a lot else going on there, particularly in China. So I think maybe that's a good place to start. So can you maybe give us that big picture overview of what is this Chinese stimulus that you're talking about in the news today, the package that they've come out with, and why it's so important for the global economy more generally?
Yep, so it's a brief overview. So basically they've announced that they're going to implement 500 billion yuan and they're going to utilize it all this year. Now, the reason this is so important is because this is the third time in their history that they've kind of announced, like, deviated from their budget. And the other two times they've done that is during economic crises in 2008 and the 90s. And basically, it's quite a large package, and it's generally deviated from their normal rhetoric of China trying to be like this stable, safe country and how it handles its debt levels, which isn't necessarily true. But now their rhetoric is more Western-like and US-like, and it's like, we're going to stimulate the economy, we're going to pump all this money in. And this kind of came, one of the main reasons I think China's doing this is the US announced quite high GDP. 5.4% is what the current projections are for this year. So China's probably trying to compete with that, and this is their way of doing that. And just a big change in their rhetoric from previously. And obviously this has a big change in terms of the global liquidity, which hopefully we'll get into shortly.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting on a whole lot of different levels because it's new, really. We haven't really seen it approached that way by China before, have we? That sort of way that they're even communicating about it, like, that's a bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they do have significant budget deficits before, but usually it's done in a different manner around like special local government bonds and sovereign bonds and all this stuff, and it's not official deficits. And now they're doing like an official deficit, which is, a huge amount they've done before. So it is quite a significant deviation, and there are quite a lot of implications surrounding that.
And it's worth paying attention when they, particularly a regime that's very used to having tradition and things done in a certain way, when they change that, it's definitely worth paying attention to. Which probably leads me to my next question. And you mentioned before about global liquidity. And I said that at the start, that's something I'm really interested in. I feel that often China is overlooked, not fully overlooked. Like people do factor it into their comments around global liquidity, but often when they're talking about liquidity, they are only talking about US liquidity and what's going on with the Fed and money that's being spent there. But I would be interested in your take on where China fits into this bigger global liquidity picture. Specifically around gold and Bitcoin, because we've looked at them. They're things that I've been focusing on, and we've seen moves happening up in them that don't necessarily align with what's been going on in the US. So what's your take on that, with how China fits into that?
Yeah, so I think obviously China is the second biggest economy in the world. So they might not be as big as the US, but they should be taken into consideration under this global liquidity concept, probably more than they are in the discussion.
Yep.
And then I would say, we've seen like equities and a lot of US assets haven't really had moves recently. Yet we had a big move in Bitcoin yesterday, which you might want to get more into. And although we did have some kind of news catalysts around that, it is very possible that this Chinese stimulus stuff, obviously, you're going to be having billions pumped into the global economy, and Chinese are going to obviously diversify their assets. It's going to impact these asset classes. So I think it's quite bullish for Bitcoin and gold in general, especially those more defensive assets during these turbulent economic times. That we kind of saw equities not do as well, and these defensive assets, specifically Bitcoin, do much better.
And the Bitcoin one's really interesting to me because I've been really in that space, listening to a lot of people talking about it over the last 24, 48 hours. And you've had a lot of people who are saying, oh, this is all on the back of ETF news, because there was some news, very specific Bitcoin news that's been out in the market. But they have ignored up until now and continue to ignore this role that global liquidity does play in underlining it, because you could sort of see it coming before it had even happened. So you can't really say it was just the news of that specific event. That might have been what caused or been the catalyst for it to sort of take off on that particular day. But the actual driving factor of that is more money being in the system generally. And the thing I think a lot of people miss is that it's the debasement of currency that occurs when you have all of this additional liquidity in the system. So China's no exception there. If they're coming out and more actively stimulating by more actively pumping money into the system, that money is going to find its way around the world, because that's how money works, right? Like it's not locked to the specific area where they put it. It ends up leaking into all other parts of the Chinese economy and the global economy, which is why we see it really starting to show up in the prices of things like gold and Bitcoin. And I particularly think that's interesting because when you think about currency debasement, often we do think about gold and Bitcoin in those terms, but bigger picture, like we think about that over the long term. We say, oh, well, you can see that moving up because the value of the dollar underlying it went down, but we don't see it necessarily happening in real time. But at the moment, we do have real-time stimulus going on that is kind of been ignored.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely being ignored. I think that's a great point, that this will trickle into Bitcoin. That yes, we're not ignoring that the news obviously does play a major role, but at the end of the day, the money has to come from somewhere, and it makes a lot of sense that when there's money flowing into the system, that it's going to be from this big influx.
Yep. So, do you think, like, this is taking it a step further, and probably looking at it from a slightly different angle actually as well, but do you think that this has something to do with why China has been so interested in gold specifically, and buying? Like they've been buying hand over fist really for a little while now. We've been seeing that going on. There's anecdotal reports that I've been hearing around it being actually starting to get a bit difficult again to get gold. That supply is being sort of gobbled up by the big players. So, what's your take on that? Where China fits into this picture?
Yeah, this is something I've been very interested in, just kind of trying to piece things together. So, like I said, there's a big economic shift that happened, and then you have, for the first time in about a decade, the Chinese leader visited their central bank as well today, and all this comes on the brink of them continuing to stockpile gold. And then also you have the timing of this stimulus announcement being, recently with the US being in war and all these wars going on, and probably a lot more chaos around the globe. So if there was any time that you wanted to kind of weaken the US, you would stockpile that gold, increase the stability in your own currency, I suppose, and then announce this to really give your economy a boost. So I just think that there's a lot of pieces that are kind of coming together here. And I think that, if you're going to weaken the US, now is the time, and they've kind of prepared that with these gold acquisitions as well.
That's a really interesting point. And I think you could probably take that a step further as well and say, whether it's defensively or attack, it could be defense or attack there, by having those reserves in place. It's a case when you were talking about the fact that they are just more actively stimulating and openly doing that. It's something that they might have gotten a bit of, they might have been chastised a little bit about from the US in the past. But with these distractions you talked about, like the war, like all the things that are going on, the US really isn't in a position at the moment to be having go at anyone else for how they're managing their economy, for example. So it probably is the nice cover that they need to be able to go, well, we've seen these policies work elsewhere where you just inject more money, you really try and kickstart the economy and get everything going by just printing what you need to. They're kind of going to get away with it at the moment, because who's going to have a word against, who's going to speak up against that? And when you've got the US in the situation, I mean, they're still, I don't know if this has been resolved yet, but they're still trying to find a speaker for their government. Like there's disarray all over the place. So no one's really looking at what China's doing with their government policy. And even if they were, the US is certainly in no position at the moment to be criticizing anyone else for how they're managing it.
Yeah, and I think to further on that point, it's difficult for the US to criticize China specifically when it comes to stimulus, when like their debt is absolutely out of control and they're approving weapons deals and government contracts that taxpayers have to pay for like Ukraine and Israel and all this stuff. So taxpayers are paying a lot of money for these wars, and that's obviously showing in the debt. And it's hard for US to then go and criticize China for trying to stimulate their own economy.
So it's to me, it all adds up to a very interesting picture for precious metals, like we were talking about. Bitcoin, when you sort of put that in there on that same sort of narrative, just because if you've got new liquidity coming into the system, we know what that does, right? It pushes the prices up because ultimately it's debasing the currency. That would be my overall summary. Is there anything you would add to that based on sort of what you've been saying today?
That's a great way to finish and summarize it for sure.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for that, Banko. Really interesting. It's a topic I'm really interested in and find quite fascinating how China is really changing how they're approaching it here. Because, like I said earlier, if they're making a change, and they don't often do that, they like to do things relatively quietly and under a lot of layers of bureaucracy. If they're making a visible, open change like this, it's probably one we should be paying attention to.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that. All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching. Remember, if you've got any questions or comments for Banko, myself, or any of the guests, reach out on those social platforms and we'll try to get back to you on those. That's us for today. We'll be back tomorrow with Sam to discuss all things markets and metals. Until then, have a great rest of the day, everyone.